To get started on this exercise, download the Custom Brushes exercise folder and save it along with the rest of your work. Inside of this folder, you're going to find a single image of a variety of different textures that we're going to use to create a variety of different custom Photoshop brushes. Now keep in mind, we're only going to be covering 4 different techniques, and there's a lot of different things that you can do to create your own Photoshop brushes. So if you wish to expand on this and make more brushes beyond what I'm covering in the instructions, that's totally fine. The only thing I'm going to be looking for your grade are the 4 techniques that we cover in the instructions that I give you. So to get started, let's click on the Custom Brushes JPEG and drag it into the Photoshop icon. This will create a Photoshop document that's the correct size and dimensions that we need to work on. Next, make sure your Brush Settings panel is open and also your Layers panel is open and active. The tool we're going to be using in creating our brushes will be our regular paintbrush tool. You can locate it on the right-hand side of your toolbox, and it should just be the regular brush tool. Be sure not to confuse it with some of the other similar looking tools like the color replacement or the mixer brush tool. We want to make sure just the brush is selected. Next, if you pay attention to the tool options in your control panel, make sure yours are set to the way I have mine. We're going to be working in normal drawing mode. Keep your opacity and flow at 100% and your smoothing down to 0%. Also, for now I've turned off the pressure sensitivity for opacity and the size differences from here. Later on you can turn those on and see how those would react, but for now we're going to keep those turned off. The final thing to pay attention to are the brushes that are already loaded into your system. If you click on the brush options, yours may look slightly different depending on what brushes are on your computer, but all Photoshop brushes should have some general default brushes. And if you click on the folders, you can expand them and get an idea of what they look like. In my case, I've got a variety of soft and hard edge brushes. Some of these are going to be pressure sensitive, and I can tell it's that because it gets thinner and thicker towards the outside, towards the middle. Some of the brushes will have an extra little icon off to the right-hand side. If your brushes are like this, then that means it can only be used for this particular tool. So if I was to choose Kyle's drawing box brush, then only the paintbrush can use this particular brush setting. If I scroll down and open up some other ones, you can see this one is only for the smudge tool, or this one's only for the mixer brush tool. As we create our brushes, pay attention to how you want them to operate and maybe what tool it would be best working for. For this particular exercise, we're just going to be creating some general brushes that can be used by all different kinds of brush tools. The first thing we want to do to define a brush is to select the area of pixels we want to use as our base image. So to select pixels, let's use the regular rectangle marquee tool. With this tool, make sure you're working in regular selection mode and your feathering is set to 0 pixels. We're going to make a hatching brush first. So let's click and drag over these hatched areas. And once you have the areas selected, go up to Edit and choose Define Brush Preset. The first thing it's going to ask you to do is to give it a name. So let's give it something that's nice and descriptive. So I'm just going to call this Ben's Hatch 1. When I say OK, you'll notice it automatically swaps to my paintbrush tool. And if we look under our tool presets and scroll to the very bottom, you can see that brush has now been added into its own effect. With our area still selected, we can go up to Select and Deselect. Now if I wanted to test out this brush, I can click and drag, and you can see that this is what the brush will do at its default setting. It looks pretty cool, but now let's see if we can give it a more true dynamic setting. I'm going to go to Edit and undo my brush tool to get rid of all that area. Now all of our brush settings can be found inside of the Brush Settings panel. You get a preview at the bottom of the panel of what these settings will allow you to do and what it will look like. And all of the different things we can do to a brush can be found on this left-hand side. I usually take these one thing at a time, and then once I select it, I then go through and start to change up the different settings within the subcategory. The first one to pay attention to, for this one will be nice and easy. Let's change the brush tip shape. By choosing this one, you get an idea of changing the size of it, so I can make it larger or relatively smaller. Let's set this size to be 250 pixels. The next thing we can do is adjust the spacing. Right now the spacing is how often it'll be repeated as you click and drag your mouse. If I was to bring it in, I can bring them in a lot closer. Or if I was to space it out, you can see I can push it out a lot more. Let's set our spacing to be about 60%, right about there. The other things you can do to it, if this was going to be a true hatched type line, I wouldn't want them to all go the same direction. I want to add some random variation into the direction that it's at. So for this one, we're going to choose the shape dynamics. And here I can change up things like the size of it, making some of them randomly larger or smaller, or I can change up the angle jitter. Anytime you see the word jitter, that simply means randomness. When I click and drag this, you can see now it'll start to rotate them all different directions. And so we'll set this all the way up to 100%. Now when I click and drag, I get more of a true hatched effect because it's going in a variety of different directions. And I can go over those to add more or less shadow details as necessary. Once you've already got a brush that you like, to save the brush, look at the very bottom right corner of the Brush Shapes panel and click on New Brush Setting. Again, this will ask you to give it a specific name. This time I'm going to call this Ben's Hatch number 2. This is also where you can capture the brush size preset and include the tool settings. So this will automatically make it just a paintbrush tool. In my case, I'm going to leave both of these unchecked so I can use it on any tool. When I say OK, as with the other one, we can go up to our tool presets and scroll to the very bottom and see that Ben's Hatch 2 is now selected, and you get a better preview of exactly what it would look like. To erase away the area at the top, we can use our rectangle marquee and click and drag over this area and hit the delete key to delete it away. It'll ask you to fill it in. We're going to fill it in the contents with white, and you can see it's back to white. Here's another good tip. If you go down to the Layers panel, let's create a new layer on top of the background layer, and we'll use this as our test layer. From now on, if I need to test out a brush, I can click inside of this layer and do all the painting that I want. Then all I have to do is hit Command A to select all, hit the delete key, and it automatically deletes it away without actually affecting the background layer. That'll go much, much quicker. You'll see me swap back and forth between the test and the background layers whenever I test my brush and select the different areas. Now let's use the rock texture to explore some other different shape dynamics. In order to make this selection, we're not going to use the rectangle marquee. Instead, I want to use the regular Lasso Tool. With this tool, this will allow me to create some freehand, freeform drawing selections. Do make sure you're working in drawing mode and feather is set to 0 pixels. If we go down to our rock picture, I want you to click and drag around and kind of make a blobulous little shape, something like that with that selection. With it selected, let's go up to Edit, down to Define Brush Preset, and as with the other one, let's give it a descriptive name. So I'm going to call this Ben's Rock Brush 1. We'll say OK. Now as far as our settings go, we can go to our brush tip shape as a starting point, and let's make the size of it be 250 pixels. We'll keep the spacing at 10%. Next, turn on scattering. Scattering will allow you to take your image and scatter it along the path that you're painting on, and the more you increase it, the more scatter that it will have. We'll keep our scatter a little bit lower, around 20 to 30%. That's about good right there. But we'll also increase the count up to about 4, so there'll be more of them on there. So we want it to look a little bit like this. The next thing we want to add on is transfer. With transfer turned on, you can add jitter or randomness to the opacity and flow of your paintbrush. By default, the control of it is turned off, but we can set the control of it to be the pen pressure. So turn on pen pressure for both the flow and opacity. And this means whenever I use my pen, if I press down on it light, it'll be a low opacity, and it'll get darker the more that I press down pressure on my pen, and then lighter again. So to test this out, this is what the brush would look like. I've grabbed my pen. With light opacity, I can gradually build up and get a brush that looks more like this. So it's almost a charcoal kind of effect, and that's pretty neat. Again, you can play around with these settings to see what it would look like, but the lightness and darkness of this is really determined by the flow and the opacity of the pressure that I'm working on. The other thing you can play around with at this time is to set the flow of your brush manually up here. By doing this, this will give you a little bit more control of exactly how it will blend together, and that's working really, really nicely. I like the way this one looks, so let's save this one up. Instead of calling this a rock brush, I'm going to call this Ben's Charcoal Brush 1. And we'll say OK to that. These look really good in black and white, but now let's explore some color settings using our leaf. I'm going to go up and choose my rectangle marquee, go down to my leaf, and click and drag over that area. As with the other ones, we'll go up to Edit, Define Brush Preset, and we'll call this Ben's Leaf 1, and say OK to that. Also, before I start into my brush settings, let's go and change out our foreground and background colors. This will make it a little bit easier to see what's happening with those. So choosing a foreground color, I'm going to choose a leaf color, say of red, and then I'm going to change my background color from white to something a little bit closer to an orange or a golden color. Since leaves kind of come in those two colors, let's see if we can work and blend those two together. Next, if we go over to our brush settings, again, start off with your brush tip and shape. The size of this one will be a little bit smaller at 300 pixels, and we're going to space this out so that we can see the individual leaves as we paint them. So a spacing of about 115 or so should be good enough so we can see each individual one. Next, let's go to our shape dynamics, and let's add some random jitter to the size of it. When we increase this, this will give us much larger and smaller leaves to paint from. And we can also do some angle jitter. So I'm going to do an angle jitter of 100 and a size jitter of about 70 to 75. Leaves don't just fall in a straight line, let's add some scattering to it as well. I'll bring our scatter up to about 140 to 150, so that'll scatter across a line. That's looking pretty good as well. And let's increase the count up to 3. This way I get a lot more leaves per click. Now the final fun thing is going to be the color dynamics. With this, I can tell it to start to blend and change up the colors that I have selected. If I was to just change up the hue jitter, I've got red selected. This will give me some different colors that change out that are slightly off of red. So every time I click and drag, you see I get something slightly different. Instead, what I want to do is to have a foreground and background jitter. This means it will start to blend between the red and the orange that I had selected. So let's bring our foreground background up to about 80%. Not all the way, we don't want to go 100% for each color. And I'm going to bring the saturation up to about 40%. Now when I click and drag, you can see that it's set to red, but if I click and drag again, it chooses a different color. The last thing that we want to turn on is apply per tip. This means as I click and drag, it'll automatically be changing the color on the fly. I don't have to keep clicking over and over again. So make sure apply per tip is also turned on. Let's delete this out of the way and see what this will look like now. Much, much better. I'm liking the way those leaves look, so let's create a new one. This time we'll call it Ben's Leaf 2 and say OK to that one and save that one up. For our final brush, let's play around with this dirt texture. This time, let's choose our elliptical marquee tool, and I'm going to set my feathering to be about 30 pixels. This means it'll give me a nice soft edge of my selection. Usually when you select something that has a soft edge, it tends to blend your brush together much better. So with this one, I'm going to click and drag and create a circular selection. And I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but I've got my selected area inside of here. As with the others, let's go to Edit and Define Brush Preset. You get an idea of that soft edge now as you can see it on the preview. And for this one, we're going to call it Ben's Dirt Brush. Call this one number 1. Right now, if I was to click and drag inside of it, I'll go to Select and we deselect it. it gives me something that looks kind of like this. Again, not too bad. Let's see if we can change it up. We'll start off with our brush tip shape. We're going to give it a size of 255 pixels, and let's space it out to be about 20 or so %, right about there. As with the other one, now if I was to click and round, it puts it out a little bit more, and this is a pretty good little texture brush, but I think we can do much better as far as what I can work with for the texture. Go into shape dynamics. Let's give it an angle jitter of 100%. Now when I click around, this is a much better workable kind of texture that I can work with. But to add even more texture, let's turn on a dual brush. Dual brush allows you to select another brush that you've already saved and have a preset to, and it will apply it and blend it together with your other brushes. For this one, let's choose that crosshatch brush that we created. Ours is saved as 250 pixels, so it'll be this one. And you can see in the preview what this would look like based on the settings. So if I was to click and drag around now, you can see how it's blending together the crosshatch texture along with the dirt texture. You can play around with these settings by changing up the mode that it's being blended together. I like to use linear height, so we get something that looks a lot like this. And then let's bring our size of it down, or actually bring it up to be about 350 pixels. And let's set our spacing to bring it inward about 10 pixels. Much, much better. I like the look of that. That looks a lot more like a random pile of dirt, or the dirt texture that we would actually use if I was to use this as a brush tool. Since I like that one, let's save this one up. We're going to call this one's Bend Dirt Brush number 2. We'll say OK to that. And with that, we're finished with the 4 brushes that we need for this exercise. The last thing we want to do is to be able to group and save all of our brushes. To do this, let's go back up to our brush tool presets, click the down arrow, and you can see all of the different brushes that we created in just this exercise at the very bottom. Now if you need to get rid of a brush, let's say for instance this Bend Hatch 1, it was not really one that I want to keep. You can click on it, then click on the little cogwheel at the top right hand corner and choose Delete Brush. It'll ask you, are you sure you want to do this? We'll say OK, and that brush preset is gone. Let's do the same thing for the Bend Rock Brush 1. Click on it and delete away this brush. Say OK to that. All of the other brushes may be something that I would want to keep. To save up your brushes inside of a folder, click on the brush and then hold down the Shift key to select all of the other brushes. With all the brushes selected, you can go back to the little cogwheel at the top and choose New Brush Group. This will ask you to give it the name of your group. In my case, I'm just going to give it my name, Ben's Brushes. We'll say OK to that. You can see they're now all saved inside of this particular folder. Now the final thing I want to do is to be able to save all of these brushes in a file format that I can take to another computer and also turn in for my grade. So to save your brushes, let's select the folder that you have all of the brushes saved in. Go back up to the little cogwheel, and this time we're going to do Export Selected Brushes. Adobe's brush files are called ABR files, Adobe Brush Resource. So let's give it a name. In my case, I'm going to call it Ben's Brushes. You can give it your name for yours. I'm going to save mine to the desktop, and we'll hit Save from there. This will create an ABR file that should be on your desktop, and this ABR file is what you will turn into Moodle for a grade. Again, if you wish to create your own brushes and add them to your file as well, you're welcome to do that, but the only thing I'm looking for will be the 4 brushes that we created in using these 4 different textures.